Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagoshnik. Thank you for joining us. We are also joined by the editor-in-chief of Vikings Territory, along as a contributor to Bleacher Report and dozens of other places around the internet. Please give it up for Arif Hassan.
Hello.
How is it going? I feel like there's actual news to report. I haven't been on in a while, and so I'm a little nervous about there being actual news to report here.
No, don't worry about it. It's just the off season. Most of it's fake.
The off season where where the draft picks are made up and the trades don't matter.
Right.
No. Well, there's a little bit of things to get into here, but before we get into the trades, the signings, and the releases, just a quick note that you can support us at NorseCodePodcast.com. If you scroll down to the very bottom, there's the donate button through PayPal. All things are accepted. We really appreciate the love coming from you guys, and we will continue to pump out podcasts as often as we can, as long as there is good news, news anyway, to report. So, Mike Wallace is now a Minnesota Viking. How the hell did that happen?
Well, it was pretty sudden. I guess Viking fans were calling for a bigger splash in free agency, and they got one.
Rick Spielman is definitely somebody who we look to towards draft time as far as acquiring players. Last year was definitely a lot more busy than this year, but the idea or the view from the team seemed to be, or what the team was showing was that, we signed a bunch of people last time, but we don't need a lot of players this year. We have a decent core. We don't need as many free agents. And then we ended up picking up Mike Wallace, who we were originally going for a few years ago, and ended up settling for Greg Jennings.
Yeah, I don't know. It's unusual because if that's the way the team is thinking, then it's definitely in a much different place than a lot of fans were thinking, than analysts are thinking, than a lot of the media are thinking. And, as a member of the media, sort of, and as an analyst, sort of, I guess I kind of agree with my colleagues that I'd sort of expected the Vikings to have sort of a bigger need profile entering free agency. And given the amount of space they could have given themselves and chose not to, which I thought was kind of unusual, they could have filled a lot of those needs in free agency. And, a lot of people say you got to build through the draft, which is fine. Yeah, I think, it's probably the most efficient way to do it is to be good at drafting. But I think that, there's a couple of things. The first is that I think it's much more difficult to evaluate talent in the draft than it is in the NFL. I think that if you sign a high-value free agent, you're more likely to help yourself out than if you draft a high pick in the same spot, at least for that year, just because you can evaluate that free agent a little bit better. The draft and free agency suffer from the same problem, which is that by definition you are the highest bidder for whatever player services that you're getting, which means that you are, generally speaking, the one who is overvaluing this player's service. So, no matter what you do, you're going to overpay for a player, either with a draft pick or with free agency. There's an actual auction bidding process in free agency, whereas the auction is sort of implied in the draft. But I think it is a little bit easier to evaluate, players in free agency. The other side of this, I think, is that while it is more efficient to build through the draft by hitting your draft picks, if you can do that, you're probably only going to find 1 to 2, maybe 3 starters in the draft, whereas in free agency you can fill out sort of a lot of the needs that you have on your roster. I think people sort of diminish the idea of spending in free agency because all these teams that spend big in free agency don't do well. And they ignore a couple of things, that there are teams that do spend big in free agency and they do tend to do well. I think the Denver Broncos and the New England Patriots are pretty good examples of teams that spend a lot of money in free agency that do well. Baltimore Ravens sign a lot of players in free agency. They tend to do well. and they just focus on teams that have a lot of needs and therefore have a lot of players to sign and therefore sign the most, without taking into account that if you spend relative to your need profile, you might be doing a good job. That doesn't mean everyone has to sign a crippling contract like the Ndamukong Suh contract at Miami, but I think that you can sign high-value free agents to fill a couple of needs and still do well.
And as a fan, it's much easier to say, well, we've seen that player perform at the pro speed, at the pro level, as opposed to, well, they're not tested out there. They haven't actually experienced a pro game before. So a lot of fans, we want to get the free agent as opposed to actually sitting and waiting and finding out if the person's any good.
Yeah, known quantities are always a little bit more. Maybe not exciting because unknown quantities carry their own excitement, but they're more prone to create enthusiasm, I think, like positivity.
Yeah. So Mike Wallace ends up kind of coming out. The reports started trickling in as that Mike Wallace was going to be was coming to Minnesota, and from the Twitter reaction anyway, that came as a big surprise that Miami was talking to the Vikings at all about it. And initial reports were that Wallace was not particularly happy that he got traded to the Vikings, but has since gone out and denied those reports. What was interesting about the Mike Wallace signing, though, is how quickly people started going, well, he quit on his. It seemed like he quit on his former team, or it seemed like he quit on the Dolphins. Do you feel that he ended up quitting on the Dolphins there, or was it more of an argument with the coach and demanding more touches? What was your take on the end of his season?
So the story, as it was originally reported back in December, and the story gets re-reported again at this point, but the story that was originally reported back in December was that Mike Wallace asked out of the game because, actually, there is no because. I mean, he asked out of the game. We don't really know why, and so many people at the time referred to it as a benching, whereas it was more of we just can't take it right now. And you asked out of the game, so we're taking you out of the game. You don't want someone out there who's like docking plays and stuff like that. I think at the time, a lot of players on the Dolphins team were hurt by that. They thought that he had abandoned them. Today, I don't know if you saw it, Mike and Marquise Pouncey had an interview with the CBS station, and in that interview, they called him a coward. Since then, one of the Pouncey brothers, has denied it. Marquise Pouncey has denied it. And said, now I know why Marshawn Lynch gives the media short phrases. And he says that's not the context of the interview, and they followed us around all day, and they took him. Not really. That doesn't seem likely to me. It feels like Mike Wallace let his teammates down. A lot of people thought he let his teammates down by basically quitting on this game. And it's interesting because that means he's bookended his Miami career with frustration with the coaches, because in the first game that he had with them, I think it was against the Cleveland Browns, he only got one target. And if he didn't get one target, he only had one catch. And he was frustrated at that, and he expressed that frustration that he wasn't a big part of the game plan in a game that they had won. So this is somebody who that's kind of who he is. I mean, there were reports of this in Pittsburgh as well, that he would complain about his usage and how often he would get touches and stuff like that. And I think he's probably the same player.
It's entirely possible. And again, on Twitter, the remarks were, let's see if he tries that with Mike Zimmer. But if you're in a Mike Tomlin offense and you're pulling that same crap, it seems like unlikely that moving on to Mike Zimmer is going to be that much of a difference. Tomlin is still widely considered as a very good and tough coach out there. So I just find it difficult to think that his attitude is going to change just because he's working with Mike Zimmer.
Yeah, I'm not so sure it justifies the signing to say that you have a disciplinarian at coach because, or rather the trade, because the net effect of that is, like, if your argument, or if an argument is, well, Mike Zimmer won't put up with that, what that means is that Mike Wallace is going to get benched if he keeps on doing this. And so now you're trading for a player who's not going to see the field. And, and obviously that's the player's fault, but you traded knowing that was a risk given your coach's coaching style and the player's, sort of locker room manner, right? Like, so
Right.
I don't know that it's necessarily a good thing unless you can make an argument that Mike Zimmer can deter that kind of behavior with sort of his player relationships, which, in fairness, he's actually very good at that sort of thing. But I don't know when the last time Mike Zimmer really had a diva that he had to deal with, because Percy Harvin was before his time, Jerome Simpson was cut before camp. Adrian Peterson, you wouldn't really call a diva. It's just sort of its own unique situation. So I don't know how he's dealt with it at Cincinnati. I don't know that he had one. I mean, some people call Taylor Mays a diva. I don't think that's true. He's just good looking. It's really not a diva. He's kind of pouty, but he got demoted pretty quickly. So
and then it would just turn out that we ended up wasting what, the fifth round pick we sent over.
Yeah, we sent a fifth, got back a seventh. The net is a sixth. I guess maybe the best comparisons to that would be like Pac-Man Jones. I wouldn't necessarily call it diva. It's just a person with off-field problems.
Yeah. But so what essentially we ended up doing was we took the Matt Castle trade and moved the pick over to this. So if you want to look at it, we ended up trading Castle for Mike Wallace through another team.
And got 2 sevenths in the process, one this year and one next year.
And got a couple of sevenths out of it. Like, that's not bad, Spielman. That's certainly not bad at all. So, we have Mike Wallace on the team. For those who have never watched Mike Wallace play, what are his positives? What can he do well? Is he good in traffic?
Well, no. Well, so the thing that he's known to be good at is that he's one of the fastest players in the NFL in pads. He has enormous field speed. He knows how to use it, and it is a constant threat. People change their coverage in response to him, and those coverage changes do create the possibility of opening up space for other receivers, although in ways that I think good receivers know how to take advantage of and bad receivers don't. But he's a deep threat. I mean, he led the league in like, I think it was yards per reception his rookie year, and then he had a higher yards per reception the year after that, and then it dipped a little bit since then, and then he did a poor job of it in Miami, but that's partially because the receptions that he got were not good because Ryan Tannehill doesn't have very good deep accuracy. It's a big issue, with him. But yeah, no, he's got extraordinary deep speed. He's got pretty good agility. He certainly has enough functional agility to take advantage of it and make use of his deep speed. But yeah, when you watch some of the games that you'd see him in Pittsburgh, the announcers would constantly say stuff like, well, look at that. Looks like it's impossible to overthrow Mike Wallace. And with Big Ben, that's kind of like a lot to say. So yeah, he's the kind of player that can get, that can sort of tilt the defense, and get things going. But, a lot of people already know that about him. I would say that sort of other things that are true about him is that, while I wouldn't say necessarily he's great in traffic, I would say that he's better at catching the ball in tight spaces than a lot of people give him credit for. I think he's better against press coverage than a couple people give him credit for, because a lot of people think of him as like maybe not a split end, but a deep threat from the flanker position, which means he doesn't have to line up at the line of scrimmage, which means he doesn't have to deal with as difficult press coverage. which is fine. That's actually all still true. He doesn't always line up the split end position. In fact, he lined up the flanker position kind of a bit while at Miami and while at Pittsburgh. But he is better against press coverage in those situations. Beyond that, I would say he's a little bit underrated in his intermediate routes. He does a pretty decent job with them, but he has a really, really imbalanced route tree, which I think everyone knows. 25% of his routes with Miami were go routes. They were just streaks straight down the field. Very rarely ran a full route tree. Very rarely ran dig routes, corner routes, out routes. Ran some comeback routes, but ran a lot more curl and post routes. And they dominated. 60% of his routes were curl, posts, or goes.
It's the Moss principle. It's the run down the field.
Yeah, that's part of it. Moss, I mean, I shouldn't have to say this. I mean, Moss was a much more talented receiver. But, one of the things that Moss was good, he was a great route runner that a lot of people didn't really think about or give him credit for because his highlights were always him blazing past someone, all 6'4", all 6'5" of him, and then just throwing his hand up and catching the ball. And so, Mike Wallace is good at a thing, and so they make him do that thing a lot. He's not that great at this other thing, so they don't make him do that other thing a lot. It's basically that simple. So he only has really 3 routes that he runs out of the 9 basic routes in the tree. He does occasionally do screens, although in Miami they didn't do it as much as they did in Pittsburgh. It created some issues, I think, in terms of his success rate, just because when you do one thing so consistently often, teams know how to adjust to it. And they needed to throw in, a couple of, I wouldn't call them decoy routes, but other routes to increase his success rate when he is running deep. It's basically like, if you run the ball so often and you don't actually engage in play action, you're kind of wasting some of your ability and you're making your running a little bit less effective. So I think it's a little bit of that. I think Miami wasn't using him necessarily all that well, and they needed to have him run a greater route tree, but he also isn't great at many of those other routes. He is pretty good against zone coverage. He knows where to find the seams in zone coverage when given the opportunity. Again, difficult to tell because some of the better routes that are zone beaters, he didn't run that many of them. But he's pretty good at that. I would call him a pretty decent player against man coverage. I don't know if he's a diverse enough piece that I'm really happy with what he can bring the Vikings, but if the Vikings can make up for losing Greg Jennings in other pretty significant ways, that'd be nice.
Yeah, and when he got signed, everybody said, "Hold on." Obviously Greg Jennings is still going to be the number one is still be listed as the number one receiver on the depth chart, and then seemingly out of nowhere, Greg Jennings is released.
Yeah, I was surprised. Some people said that they expected Greg Jennings to be released in this context. I didn't, because Greg Jennings was working on a restructure, and he was going to, restructure for $6 million-ish, according to Darren Wolfson at ESPN, which included maybe some future guarantees. And they were in talks, and then the Wallace trade happened, and then according to Greg Jennings, as he was talking to Chris Thomason at the Pioneer Press, the next day he was, released. Like the talks they basically stopped as soon as they acquired Mike Wallace. So it doesn't sound like they were attempting to keep both of them on the roster at the same time, which is a little disingenuous. The Vikings were telling Greg Jennings that they wanted to keep him. It's upsetting because I think that Jennings is the receiver that is most capable of taking advantage of how Mike Wallace changes defenses. Because most people, when they talk about taking the top off of a defense, will just say it opens up the underneath game. But they won't really explain sort of how or why or what receivers can take advantage of it. Most of the time, what that means is that, there are subtle or changes in the way that coverage is played. So in a cover 1 or a cover 3 situation, the middle deep safety will shade over to Wallace's side. That can open up parts of the game if you're running a post route or even a streak, or if you're in the slot up the seam. because then you can take advantage of that extra space that's given to you by just angling your route a couple of yards one way or the other. You know, you have some smaller, better opportunities for yards after the catch. You have the ability to have Wallace running clear out routes to force the underneath cornerback if they're in sort of cloud zone coverage to backpedal a little bit faster, and because of that, you've got really good opportunities for wheel routes and stuff like that. But there are a lot of the adjustments that you need to make. I mean, he doesn't get double teamed as much. I mean, he's not Randy Moss. I mean, deep threats don't necessarily get double teamed. Torrey Smith does not get double teamed, right? They're not Des Bryant, they're not Randy Moss, they're not Calvin Johnson. And so you're not taking away defenders, you're just moving them around the field a little bit. When you move them around the field, that creates opportunities, but you need receivers who can take advantage of those opportunities. And the receiver who could best take advantage of those opportunities was Greg Jennings. And so I thought he was going to be on the roster because of that. But there is a report, and I need to find it again and link it in the show notes, but there is a report that Norv Turner didn't like how much Greg Jennings was getting beat up at the line of scrimmage. I don't know that I agree with that, or that I think that is a reasonable basis for releasing Jennings, given sort of all of the other things that he provided for that offense. But I mean, I guess if that's the case, then Norv Turner was willing to functionally, exchange Mike Wallace for Greg Jennings, because it seems like the Vikings are viewing this as one move, right? We talked about earlier, you trading Matt Castle for Mike Wallace. That's a nice conceptual way to put it. It's a nice way to put it on a balance sheet, but you really should evaluate each trade in their own individual context. Just so happens I think both trades were good, so the balance sheet looks even better. But the Vikings didn't really trade Matt Castle for Mike Wallace. I mean, who knows what would have happened if one of those trades, didn't go down, right? The other one probably still would have. But in this case, it seems like it is a package deal where Greg Jennings was going as a result of Mike Wallace coming in, which means the Vikings, who are not restructuring Wallace this year, were willing to pay $16 million of cap space. Remember, that's Darrelle Revis money. That's how much Ndamukong Suh's average per year is in Miami. That's more than Larry Fitzgerald's cap hit now that he's restructured. Right? They're willing to basically consume $16 million of cap hit to bring Mike Wallace in if they don't want Greg Jennings, because that's the $6 million cap hit for releasing him. And I think that's dumb. And I think that really bothers me a lot, because Mike Wallace is not that good. He's never proven to be that good. He didn't command that much. The mythical Vikings offer that Mike Wallace's dad said the Vikings gave him wasn't that much. So it bothers me a lot that the Vikings made a pair of moves that functionally consumed $16 million of cap space for Mike Wallace, because the word was that Mike Wallace was going to restructure before the trade. And then the word after the trade was that he wasn't going to do it. And it would have been nice to be able to restructure both of those receivers. Maybe Greg Jennings at $7 million for the year in terms of cap hit. Maybe Mike Wallace at a similar amount, $7 million, probably closer to $6 million. Either way, $14 million maybe, right? Probably less, but if we want to be conservative, $14 million of cap hit for those two receivers. Probably a bit high, probably overpaying for the kinds of production and talent that they have together. But I'd rather pay $14 million for those two receivers who would instantly and obviously be the two best receivers on the roster by miles than $16 million for one of those receivers. And so I'm really bothered by the trade and what happened with Greg Jennings as a result.
It just seemed very strange when it happened, and people on Twitter were even saying that we haven't really felt this strange about a release since Antoine Winfield was suddenly let go. Like, it just had that sort of feeling to it. I don't necessarily think that it had that same effect of a gaping hole on the team or anything, but it just ended up feeling very similar. It was just, oh, well, that's kind of surprising. But the other thing about the Jennings thing is, it's not like he's been thrown to a whole hell of a lot. Ponder seemed to have been allergic to him during most of his tenure. He just didn't end up getting anything from Ponder. And it was good to see a quarterback actually utilize his talents when Bridgewater came in and started hitting him. Granted, he was hitting other receivers as well, but he was making sure that Jennings ended up getting some touches. So it's just, I almost feel bad for Jennings here because he was just starting to actually get targets. And he has a quarterback that actually wants to throw to him now, that Christian Ponder is no longer on the squad. Sorry, it feels really good to say that Christian Ponder is no longer a Viking. Can we all just take a moment and just... Ponder is not on the team. But I just feel bad for Jennings because he spent all that time not getting thrown to by Ponder, and now that Bridgewater is going into a second year, has a little bit of chemistry with him, and now he's gone.
Yeah, it's certainly frustrating because, first, Greg Jennings with Matt Castle last year in 2013 would have had an over 1,000-yard season, given sort of the way that Matt Castle and Greg Jennings were interacting in common games. So it's clear that once he had a quarterback that was willing to use him, that he could be the kind of productive player that he was in Green Bay. And, that sounds absurd, but, he was brought in from Green Bay after 3 seasons of 1,200, 1,100, and 1,200 yards, plus a shortened plus 2 shortened seasons of 950 yards and 370 yards because he only started 5 games in that final season before signing with the Vikings. I think that Greg Jennings' talents were not being evaluated properly, and I think that a lot of people who listen to this podcast sort of know what my feelings are on Greg Jennings. I thought he was always open. I thought he was the best receiver on the roster. I thought, in fact, he was overpaid, but in the context of him being overpaid, it wasn't nearly as much as people were saying for what he was doing in terms of his performance on the field. And the difference was actually just a problem of production, which isn't really as much his fault. The biggest issue with analyzing Greg Jennings, I think anyway, is you have to separate value to the team with basically deserve. He doesn't deserve to be cut based off of his performance, but that's not what sort of writes NFL checks. What does he provide productive value for the Vikings, or rather, actually, a more important question is, will he provide productive value for the Vikings? And I think in that context, he didn't, but he will. Because I thought that he was the kind of player that was pretty consistently open, who could get, a good amount of receiving yards. He led the team in touchdowns despite, concerns about the fact that he was a slot receiver and concerns about his size. It's just kind of silly, I think, that, he's getting knocked for not producing in situations where he absolutely would not have been able to produce. In games where you only had, Teddy Bridgewater, you can take a look at, he produced exactly as many yards as Larry Fitzgerald in those same weeks. And over the course of those games, he had a 70% catch rate, which is higher than anyone else on the roster. And those 650 yards, they aren't stellar by any means, right? But they were, I think, enough of an indication that Greg Jennings can be utilized by Teddy Bridgewater. And I think that he would have been exposed more in this next season because he was getting open at places that would really help the offense. And one of my Twitter followers was telling me that, maybe Greg Jennings is getting open. Maybe he's a good receiver. Maybe he's, got good hands and he can help the offense. But I think that the construction of the offense is such that Greg Jennings' particular talents, the routes that he was running, were not helpful to the offense. I think there's a lot of merit in that argument. That's at Crosserific, who's actually a pretty great follow. He's a very smart guy. I think that's a pretty decent argument. But I think that in terms of the route progression and where Greg Jennings was open and the fact that he was open even when Teddy was throwing to other receivers, I think he was a better option on many of those plays. He could have gotten a first down. Now, Teddy, obviously, in those last 5 games, Jennings wasn't producing a ton, and Greg Jennings wasn't, catching a huge plurality of those receiving yards. Teddy had like a 70%, completion rate, and there was a pretty good yards per attempt. But one of the issues, I think, is that the decisions that were made by Teddy Bridgewater, in those cases were good but not great, because I think that the better decisions in many of those cases was to throw to Greg Jennings. And a good example is that Teddy would throw, short of the sticks on first and second down a lot in order to advance the ball, where Greg Jennings was open beyond the sticks, and that he was a better throw, and that you could better increase the team's drive success rate, their chances of a successful drive in terms of scoring points and stuff like that. If he had just thrown to Jennings instead, it also would have increased his yards per attempt. So the fact that Teddy had a good end of season without Greg Jennings producing a lot is not an indication that Greg Jennings is not important to the offense, especially because Mike Wallace wasn't on that offense either. So you can't really say, well, Teddy produced without blank receiver being a big part, so you don't need blank receiver. Because that's just an argument for not bringing in any receivers. So I think that Greg Jennings was really valuable to the offense, and they shouldn't have gotten rid of him.
So with Jennings gone then, the next logical receiver to step up is a guy that both of us are pretty high on, Jarius Wright. Is it time for Jarius Wright to really have a breakout? I feel like we've asked this question the last couple seasons.
We have.
I really like the guy. He's
I
really
love
good.
I love him. Yeah, no, we both, and let's include Dusty, all three of us love Jarius Wright in terms of what he can provide for the offense. When he's on the field, I think he's, electric in a particular way. And I think that electricity will be fun to see. I just don't think that Jarius Wright is the same kind of receiver as Greg Jennings in a lot of big ways. And I don't think that's not really an insult. I mean, obviously I'm a huge fan of Greg Jennings, so, the further away you are from Greg Jennings, the further you are away from God. But I still think that Jarius Wright, can provide a lot of advantages to the offense. And the one benefit to not having Jennings on the roster is that you get more opportunities to put Jarius Wright on the field. Actually, I think that's an issue of, the construction of the offense, less than it is an issue of having Greg Jennings on the roster. But whatever way you need to do it, Norv Turner, now you've got Jarius Wright on the field. The thing that Jarius Wright can provide, and I'm not comparing them in terms of sort of the way they are athletic, but the way that they are played and the way that they win, I think Jarius Wright as a slot receiver is much closer to Victor Cruz because he's much more of a deep threat from the slot. Jarius Wright has had 11 targets over 20 yards in the slot alone, and that's despite the fact that he had something like 85 total routes in the slot. So I think that it's pretty clear that the balance of Jarius Wright's play is to take advantage of his speed and to get open deep. And it's not just on, these deep streaks, that Mike Wallace is known for. Wright also runs his fair share of post routes. I think he's a very intelligent route runner. He runs a fair share of corner routes. I think that he takes advantage of a lot of the seams and zones pretty well. Again, I wouldn't quite compare him to, Jennings, or if we want to move away from comparing him to Jennings, some other pretty talented route runners in the league. You could talk about an underrated receiver like Michael Crabtree, who's on the market right now, also underproducing with an unusual quarterback situation. Or Larry Fitzgerald, right? I wouldn't, put him up there as a route runner, but I would say that he's a pretty smart route runner that could take advantage of the zone, of the seams in zone coverage, and he can get some separation in man coverage too, partially a result of his speed. The difference is that being an intelligent route runner and being a good route runner are different, and knowing where you need to be and enabling that ability are two starkly different things. And I think Jarius Wright lacks a couple of things that would make him a good route runner. I don't think he's as sudden at the break. I don't think that he can provide the kind of quickness in and out of routes, in and out of cuts that generates instant separation the way that a lot of slot receivers in the league can do. I mean, Wes Welker in his prime is a really good example of a player who won with pretty solid quickness in those cuts. And I don't think Wright is that kind of player, which is fine because there's a way you can design an offense around that's really useful and very good. But it is a different looking offense than what Greg Jennings will provide from the slot. And it's unusual because that's sort of what Mike Wallace does. He gets open deep. Obviously, Mike Wallace is much faster than Jarius Wright, but Jarius Wright is underrated for his speed. The way they used him at Arkansas is actually much different than the way he can be used in the NFL. He's a possession receiver at Arkansas who won with route running and won short routes and moved the chains. Whereas in the NFL, he's actually better as a deep threat than he is as a possession receiver because he still doesn't have that route running ability. He has some level of deception, which is good, but I don't think it's enough to overcome some of the issues he has with short area quickness. And that might be a footwork thing. That might not be like an endemic thing that's like his physical makeup dictates that, he's closed off from certain abilities. He might be quick enough in the abstract to do these things, but his footwork in games may be such that he can't run routes nearly as well as a lot of other receivers who run from the slot. So he's a much different receiver. And I think this creates a problem because if he's a big play receiver and Mike Wallace is a big play receiver and Cordero Patterson is completely inconsistent and Charles Johnson is very raw and Adam Thielen is an undrafted free agent from Mankato State who made the fifth receiver spot as a special teams ace, who do you have catching passes on third down? And I don't think the Vikings have a solid answer there. I think Wright can become that player. But he to his credit, he has a high catch rate and a low drop rate. But I think that in terms of the kinds of skills he brings to the table, it's not as good as a normal possession receiver on third down. Because when I say it's a low drop rate, I think it's a low drop rate holistically over the past 3 years. But he has had some issues with drops that people don't talk about. It is probably an average drop rate this year. And you want to adjust it a little bit because the difficulty of his catches are a little bit more than a typical receiver, and so the drop rate is going to be naturally higher even if you have the same skill level. But he's not a consistent or reliable receiver. The Vikings just don't have that on the roster now. And so if the Vikings want to become a big play offense, that's fine. It would fit the stereotype of a North Turner offense. It doesn't really fit the execution of most North Turner offenses. I mean, you take a look at San Diego. You tended to get a lot of third down movement. You take a look at sort of the Coryell offenses in Dallas, especially when they had Terrell Owens, or even Des Bryant, who is both a big play and a possession receiver, and you get a lot of good catches on third down, good movement, to advance the chains. And you don't have that with the Vikings now. And I like Jarius Wright a lot. I think he's really helpful for the offense. It'll be fun and exciting to see him. But he's going to need to advance his game in a big way in order for him. He doesn't even need to fill Greg Jennings' shoes because evidently those are shoes that do not need to be filled, but to replace the reliability that Greg Jennings has.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what ends up happening in the next couple months, and if we end up looking at picking up a receiver in the draft, or if we have decided that we have all the people that we need for it. It was interesting reports from Adam Thielen, who is the toast of the town in both Mankato and in Detroit Lakes, since he went to school in Detroit Lakes. It's funny just how much people are going nuts for the guy. It's good for him. Congratulations to him. He's having he had a hell of a year last year, and hopefully he stays on the team. But man, that's an interesting wide receiver core.
It is
that we're going into. Let's talk about the reason why many of you are listening to us this week: the departure of Christian Ponder. A man drafted as the replacement for Brett Favre, brought in with many, many hopes.
We should have realized then
Yeah. Well, if you want to be,
You could fill the hole in our franchise left by Brett Favre. Well,
and
maybe you're doomed to fail.
and spackle over the mistake of Donovan McNabb. I think that's a fairly accurate thing to say. To spackle over that. But yeah, Christian Ponder is no longer with us. Not that he's dead, but he's in Oakland.
So he's dead.
Oakland is so he's dead. Yeah, Oakland has decided to just pick up a couple of real interesting pieces over the last couple days, including Trent Richardson.
Yeah, they have Trent Richardson. They have Christian Ponder.
They got rid of Matt Schaub. I don't know if Christian Ponder is going to be able to throw pick sixes as nicely or as beautifully or as accurately and consistently as Matt Schaub, but they let go of Matt Schaub and they have Christian Ponder now. They won't have Matt Schaub to kick around anymore. Oh no.
Oh no.
Oh no.
Yeah, no. I mean, if you take a look at the transaction report, it's either a bunch of terrible players or a bunch of players that you probably hadn't heard of, which isn't to say that they're bad. So you've got Curtis Lofton, who was good a couple years ago, is no longer good. You've got Christian Ponder, you've got Trent Richardson, you've got Nate Allen, all bad. And then you've got James Dockery and Stephen Clark. Neither of them are going to make the roster. You've got Roy Halou, pretty decent, pretty good, not a foundation back. That's fine. He's quick, he's good. Then you've got Rodney Hudson, massively overpaid, but a very good center. And you got tight end Lee Smith, who exists, which is nice.
It's good to have a player who exists.
Yeah. And so they signed Super Bowl MVP Malcolm Smith, who did not make the starting linebacker core for the Seahawks, because it turns out if you make a special play in the Super Bowl, that doesn't mean that you're an amazing player. Otherwise, the Giants would have kept David Tyree.
And David Tyree would have had more than just that one catch to end his career.
Right. And they also have Dan Williams, who is a nose tackle and therefore underrated, but still not very good. It's very difficult to find people who accurately gauge nose tackles, and Dan Williams is not that great at it. So that's what the Oakland Raiders have done in the offseason. Everyone expected them to be huge players from free agency because they had enormous amounts of cap space. They had needs everywhere, but they did have to convince people to play for Oakland. That was
So instead of going to Macy's or some Nordstrom, some nice upscale place, they decided to go to the dollar store, and they picked up Trent Richardson for a steal. You see this? He's a little scuffed, and he falls down when I try to stand him up, but I can get him for like $2 million.
It's
great. Who throws away a perfectly good used Christian Ponder anyway? This is amazing. Look at what white people throw. This is insane.
The Dolphins go to Neiman Marcus, pick up an Ndamukong Suh. The Jaguars go to Macy's, pick up a Julius Thomas. The Raiders go to a flea market and pick up Trent Richardson.
Exactly. Wow.
Best values found at flea markets, guys.
And I can pick up ABBA records too while I'm at it. Score. Do they come with Trent Richardson, or do I have to pay? Oh, okay. So Christian Ponder no longer a Viking. We're going to discuss the problem this raises for our podcast a little bit later, but this was certainly big news to us here at Norse Code. Next person who left of interest is Jasper Brinkley, who is moving on to play for Jerry Jones down in Dallas.
Okay, well, I'll say this about Jasper Brinkley, and it is actually somewhat true-ish of Christian Ponder. I will say that Christian Ponder was not set up to succeed. Doesn't mean he's good. Wasn't set up to succeed with the Minnesota Vikings, and I hope he does well. Jasper Brinkley was largely a victim of circumstance, who had a lot of his explosive characteristics taken away by injury. He never recovered them. Wasn't a very good Tampa 2 middle linebacker. I have no idea what Leslie Frazier was doing with Jasper Brinkley in terms of his coverage responsibilities, how often he was on the field, and what he was asked to do, because it turns out when he went to Arizona for 4 games, and his Pro Football Focus score is higher than his actual, I would say, his performance. But he went to Arizona, played for 4 games while one of the linebackers was suspended, did all right. signed with the Minnesota Vikings, and I thought did a very good job with the Vikings because they didn't ask him to do that much, but what they asked him to do, he was very good at, and it helped the defense in a big way. And I think without Jasper Brinkley, I think if you'd put, Aaron Henderson in, that the run defense, which is already a problem, 22nd, I think, in the league in yards per carry, somewhere around the same in run success rate. I think that you would have had significantly bigger problems against the run, which creates problems in terms of preventing first downs and stuff like that. So I thought Jasper Brinkley was pretty good for the Vikings. If they had re-signed him, I would have seen that as sort of a bandage move as they tried to figure out sort of what they were going to do with their linebackers in free agency in the draft. They didn't talk to him for most of the free agency period. I guess they did offer him a deal once. He took the Dallas 2-year deal instead of the Vikings 1-year deal. I don't know what Dallas intends to do with their linebacker core because I don't know if they expect Sean Lee to be around, but it sounds like Jasper Brinkley is going to play as a Sam linebacker there, but he's not going to have very many coverage responsibilities. Rolando McClain, if he's re-signed, is going to be a will linebacker there, even though he was the Mike linebacker last year, and that's sort of where he revived himself. And then Sean Lee, hopefully, is going to be the Mike linebacker, because when he's healthy, he's not Patrick Willis good, but I'd say he's better than Luke Kuechly. So, I think that's an interesting place for him to go. If they use him well, he's a good fit. If not, but that's most of his career. Too bad. He's made money being misused, so that's good. But yeah, I think
that's a hell of a talent,
right? So I'll just finish on. I think that he was underappreciated in this final season with the Vikings. So yeah.
Good luck to the three of them. Certainly a nice good luck to Christian Ponder there. It's not often that you get a second chance over in Oakland, especially after how poorly he treated his last year here. So it'll be interesting to see what ends up happening out there. I'm not surprised that he ended up in Oakland. I'm more surprised that he was moved over there and immediately put into a number 2 spot. Like just the nature of the backup quarterback market, I suppose. But it seemed like even Oakland was going to be a little weary of a little bit leery of actually grabbing him for a 2 spot. Or they just realized what a garbage fire they had in Matt Schaub. Either way.
It's just unusual. They have this young quarterback, and he's got as much experience as Teddy, right? He's a rookie last year. He had a pretty decent season. I think there's actually some red flags that are similar to Mike Glennon's red flags, just statistically, not on film. They're very, very different on film, that make it such that Teddy Bridgewater's year is much better than Derek Carr's year. But there's like Oakland fans and some other people that think that because Derek Carr had a better touchdown interception ratio, that he had a better rookie year. Either way, I think that Derek Carr's rookie year was at least somewhat promising. It wasn't discouraging like Blake Bortles' was. And again, rookie years, I mean, players have bad rookie years all the time. They turn into good players. So having that promising-ish rookie year for Derek Carr, you'd want to bring in a veteran that can mentor him. And I actually don't think Matt Schaub is bad at that role, right? Like I don't think that Matt Schaub, for his penchant for throwing pick sixes, is a bad pick, because there's not many times you can get a player who was top 10 at his position for years and have him be your mentor. Because what made him that quarterback mentally, that's all there. He might be a little bit slower processing it because of age. He might have a weaker arm. He might whatever happened as he aged and became just awful. All of that isn't going to apply to the kinds of things that a veteran backup quarterback can do for you in the film room, on the sidelines. And a lot of people sort of diminish the importance of a backup quarterback, and I understand why. They don't play. But they provide an alternative perspective, and they provide an invaluable role in game preparation. And I thought Matt Schaub was excellent for that. Now, I will say that Christian Ponder is good at those things that you want a backup quarterback to do that don't involve playing the actual game. Matt Schaub, also good at those things. I would think that Matt Schaub is better at it given his experience. I would think that Christian Ponder's lack of experience for a quote-unquote veteran backup, I think would be a little bit worrisome. So I'm a little, intrigued by this, but maybe, Musgrave's worked with Ponder, so, he wants someone to teach, Derek Carr the concepts that Ponder used in Minnesota. Maybe, part of it is just you want a quarterback that you're familiar with that's not going to challenge you. It could be like a coaching ego thing. Or maybe, Musgrave and the Oakland staff think that there was potential and that he was somehow limited from that potential in Minnesota in ways that are not Musgrave's fault. So who knows?
Yeah, he did start a year that brought us to the playoffs. I mean, that was the season where Adrian Peterson decided to run for over 2,000 yards and everything. But he was under center. He handed that ball off fantastically.
Yeah, he saw some really good blocks from the offensive line. He saw some pretty good runs. He could describe them in detail.
And could describe them so that Trent Richardson's going to go out there and be able to pull that off, right? No. Not exactly. Let's look at a couple of the. Let's look at some of the interest, and one thing I just want to report on quickly. Michael Johnson was brought in as a possible person from the Bucs, and a lot of people had suggested that the Vikings were looking at picking him up. Went up to Minnesota and decided that wasn't going to work out. Ended up going to the Bengals. Ended up signing there, going with his former team as opposed to his former coach. What I want to point out here is that in the interview after the dinner, because they went out to Manny's Steakhouse in downtown Minneapolis, and if you've never had it, you really should set aside like $150 and just do it. But Spielman said that since it was on a Friday, that he didn't eat the meat, he didn't have steak, leading to the question: what kind of a man? Not kind of what kind of a person goes to Manny's and doesn't get the steak?
I have no idea. Like, I understand. He was like, well, I gave up whatever I needed to give up that prevented me from eating steak for Lent. I don't know. I guess Spielman is a religious-ish person, but with how often he lies, like,
that's it. That's exactly it. It's like, yeah. I mean, I realize, and I may have said this on Twitter as well, I realize that the lobster there is the size of Randy Moss's ego. I get that. But still, that's... You go to Manny's, you have a steak. I think they even have like a vegetarian option on there just for profiling so they can kick you out. Like, it's just not okay. Who goes to Manny's and doesn't have steak?
I don't know, it's the thing that they're the best at. Like, that's the thing.
The nationally ranked thing. It's amazing. People travel hours for Manny's is fantastic. But moving on from somebody that we didn't end up getting to somebody that we're in the process of looking at is Terrence Newman. Is there anything new on Terrence Newman?
No, he visited the Vikings. He's going to visit the Patriots. No new news from that front.
And another person we want to talk about is George Selvey.
He actually, I think he would be a pretty good pickup because I think that he's a very good defensive end who, as a starter, wasn't as stellar, but I think among backup defensive ends is very good. If you can get a guy who, when he starts, gets 7 sacks over 16 games, then you've got the kind of backup defensive end that can be more effective than I think most rotational defensive ends. I think that he can be better than like Wallace Gilberry, for example, in Cincinnati, who admittedly was stunted by being forced to move inside. But I think he's a very good player. The Vikings have maintained interest with him for some time, but they haven't really, made a move for him because he's not in the first tier or even the second tier of free agents at his position. And so he's sort of in his own holding pattern. I don't know that he's deciding, but, between, multiple players. But he is, being looked at probably by a couple of teams, but especially the Vikings. And I think he could be a good ad. I don't know that they're moving quickly on him, but he is probably the next free agent most likely to land with the Vikings.
So outside of the Vikings, the league's been a little bit interesting in spots. It's been fairly quiet, except if your name is Chip Kelly, you just apparently are in Madden and just going, sure, why not try this? You guys covered the signings last week of at quarterback and at a running back and everything with DeMarco Murray and Sam Bradford. But was it yesterday? Yeah, it was on the 16th where Chip Kelly had Tim Tebow working out for them. Really? Tebow's working out for you? Like, at this point, are you just trolling us all, Chip Kelly, and being like, yeah, well, why not? Maybe he thinks that somebody's going to catch him at what he's doing. It's like, screw it. I have enough. The problem with Chip Kelly is that he has so many potential suitors outside of the Eagles. If he messes this up that badly, that at that point, do you even care if you have a net beneath you on some of these mistakes?
Okay, so I've mentioned this on Twitter a couple of times, that Chip Kelly has a different risk calculus than anybody else, right? Because no matter what happens, he's going to get an $8 million job in college if he fails, right? So he can do whatever he wants, and that's good for the NFL. Just because
it certainly makes things a lot more interesting in the NFC East.
Well, yeah, no question. But some of Chip Kelly's ideas have already taken hold. Some of them are not, stuff you see on the field, and he's actually very open about what he's doing on the field. He breaks down plays regularly, right? He's very open about it, and he's just very quiet about the sports science stuff and all of the sort of the practice stuff, and everything that he truly believes is the engine of the team, as opposed to sort of the what you see, the picture, basically. And so a lot of those things have already filtered their way into different parts of the NFL. His practice habits, for example, some of his approaches to science, for example, those are really good for the NFL, and that's really interesting. But he's making a lot of decisions that I think are really fascinating experiments that we just haven't seen a coach have that much freedom, because first, he is given power of personnel, but second, he doesn't have to worry about risk because he can just be the coach at Oregon again. I mean, he's better than Mark Helfrich, right? So, whatever happens, Chip Kelly is going to be, totally safe, and because of that, he's taking insane risks. The problem with this, so academically, that's really interesting. As an observer, that's interesting to think about. But then the problem is, you get he hosted Tim Tebow. Well, okay, I guess that's outside of the box thinking too.
At this point, it's almost like an old war movie where he's going up on the hill and saying, "Make them remember you." He'll be remembered in Philadelphia. That's for damn sure. I don't know if it'll be for a positive or a negative, but damn it, he's trying.
Well, so I don't know if you saw this news, but he is attempting to trade Matt Barkley, and if they do eventually trade Matt Barkley, which I don't know what you could get for him, but if you do trade Matt Barkley, the reporter at NBC4 in DC, at NBC Diana, who's actually broken a lot of really good free agency signings in the past couple of days, is evidently going to sign Tim Tebow if he trades Matt Barkley. So there is the possibility that Tebow ends up on the roster. The unusual thing to me is that he could have signed Tim Tebow at literally any time. So doing it a couple days after the open of free agency is really unusual because he clearly doesn't like Matt Barkley. And so, why now? Well, you should have done it earlier and then won some games, which you did, right? So that we could stop being really confused about this offseason in terms of the universe of moves that you make, because he's made a ton of crazy moves, and it culminated into hosting a workout for Tim Tebow and potentially signing him in a world where he gets to trade Matt Barkley. I don't know that he'll be able to trade Matt Barkley because I can't imagine a market for him developing, but it's possible Tim Tebow could return to the league, and that would be really upsetting, even though it's part of a larger good process for the NFL.
The idea of you being able to trade Matt Barkley is a lot like Blaine Gabbert having a Pro Bowl bonus in his contract. Like, sure. I mean, it's a possibility. It's not going to happen, but it's a nice possibility to put on paper.
Yeah, no.
No. that I'm afraid that is not a thing. What is a thing, however, is that the Bills are now in the running for the ability to be the next team to trade or cut Percy Harvin.
Yeah, man.
What an interesting collection of people that is.
Well, I mentioned this before, but what's my favorite thing about this is that you've got a bunch of people who are around for the entirety of Christian Ponder's career that can talk shit about him. So you've got E.J. Manuel, we knew him in college. Then you've got Matt Castle, and then you've got Percy Harvin, who can bridge E.J. Manuel and Matt Castle. So you've got all kinds of stories that they can tell about Christian Ponder in Buffalo.
Dear NFL, I understand that you may need a good distraction from your mistakes, from your problems in the head offices. The fact that today it broke that Roger Goodell is not doing an episode of Between Two Ferns because he can't take a joke and because he's very serious. Even though the president was on there, he's not the president of the NFL. But I would like to ask the NFL and HBO to set aside their rules for a moment that say that a first-year head coach cannot have the team can't host Hard Knocks. Please send Hard Knocks to Buffalo. Please. Rex Ryan has been through Hard Knocks before. This will not be weird for him, probably. In fact, we'll probably get a couple of good moments where he's asking people if they're ready for some fucking snacks. Like, it's going to be great. But Percy Harvin being there too, like, I would sign up for HBO and not use somebody else's account for HBO Go. Like, I would give that amount of attention for this. This would be amazing. Please make this a possibility.
Yeah, no, it would be amazing. I would love it. I mean, yeah. Okay.
How would this not be the greatest season of the show? Screw the Bengals seasons. The Jets season is still pretty highly regarded. So it's almost like the sequel, but it's CSI to CSI Miami. Like, we're branching out. We're moving to Buffalo. Great.
No, it's fantastic. I mean, some people might get tired of the fact that Rex Ryan, I believe, has been on Hard Knocks twice already. Would be on a third time. I don't care. He is such good television, and way better than that terrible Hard Knocks they had in Atlanta. The worst one ever.
God.
It was the worst one they had.
Not even an arguable. That was just absolutely awful. Make up for it. Suspend the rules. Go up to Buffalo and just catch the shit talking that happens about Ponder. Like, just one episode where they're just sitting and talking about that. It would be fantastic. But if we're looking at other garbage fires, let's go across the country where it's clear that God hates San Francisco. Not only is your head coach gone, not only are you just losing players left and right to retirement, but you re-signed Chris Cook? Really?
I don't know, man. Someone was telling me, well, no, it makes sense because Chris Cook, he actually looked pretty good in this preseason and training camp. To which, I was like, he's kind of always actually done that. It's not like he was this terrible preseason and practice camp player for Minnesota. He just, couldn't do it once you got on the field. It's like, I don't like that. Doesn't really make sense to me. Like, you still have the same Chris Cook. He's still bad, but at the same time, they lost all their cornerbacks. So I guess that's who you're stuck with.
So I guess a person who has the same number of career interceptions that Arif Hassan does is ready for another extension.
Yeah, they should have me and him compete in camp.
I feel like that would be. Are your hands as good as his?
They're roughly 5 inches across, so probably.
it's entirely possible. I was joking before when Ponder still hadn't been signed. It's like, and you were doing all your free agent radio spots. Like, wow, Arif is getting more action on his phone this offseason than Christian Ponder. It's almost sad. So we're going to move on from discussion of the league and move on to the continuing saga. I feel like we should get music for this. If next show, I'll see if I can get a music intro for the Adrian Peterson saga. It's not quite Days of Our Lives because no one could actually believe this. But we'll talk a little bit more about Adrian Peterson. More of an update. It looks like the Cowboys are out. They have gone out and put on and grabbed Darren McFadden. Now that DeMarco Murray is going to be one of the 8 running backs up in Philadelphia. It may be less than that. I'm not sure, but 8 seems about right. The Cowboys look like they are out of the running. The Cardinals don't look totally out, but Peter King seems to think that it's not happening at the current rate that Adrian is looking. So it's basically Adrian needs to agree to restructure his deal for the new team, or he's just going to end up sticking around.
Yeah.
But mommy and daddy are still fighting is the main thing to take away from all this.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that he doesn't want to be with the Vikings. And I think that sort of all of this slow playing is because he has continued to express reservations about playing with the Vikings. And the Vikings are exercising their leverage, basically, to tell him that he's sort of at their behest. I'm not so sure that it's odd because it feels like there's some inconsistency within the organization itself as to whether or not they wanted to keep Peterson, which is unusual because of the strength of language that I had received anyway about how much they were willing to let go of him, and how much I was told after the fact that they were willing to let go of him. But it certainly seems like they want to exercise the leverage to force him to agree to some demands to play in Minnesota. But of course, Adrian Peterson wants a different set of things. So aside from the fact that he has issues with Minnesota that are not necessarily resolved by money, he also evidently wants $25 million either over the next 2 or over the next 3 years. I forget. There have been different reports. There have been different reports between the two as to which one he would want. And it doesn't really matter because then you're asking more from the Vikings than what they were originally giving you, despite the problem being what you did, right? Because the Vikings didn't do Peterson wrong, and I understand why he thought they did, but it doesn't make sense that when you increase your liability to an organization that you have the power to ask for more from that organization. Retributive pay doesn't really make a lot of sense in the NFL. I mean, this is a big problem. I think it showed up a lot in the Matt Forte negotiations a while back with Chicago. But players never get paid sort of what they're deserved. They're paid what teams think they're worth because it's that's just how the market works. And I don't know that that's, obviously because you don't get paid what you deserve, that's not necessarily a fair system. A fair system would be one that, would provide you salary based on your talent level every single day, right? Which is impossible to do and difficult. And you wouldn't also have a salary cap that would make sense. But because of that, it means that teams get to determine your market rate based off of your ability to help the team. And if you increase your liability to that team in a big way, then you decrease your ability to negotiate for additional security, in this case, guarantees. And so they're just on two completely different poles. And Larry Fitzgerald Sr., Larry Fitzgerald's dad, lives in Minnesota and is a freelance journalist. He did report that Adrian Peterson has requested a trade. No one has confirmed it. No one has denied it. But given that no one has confirmed it, it's kind of difficult to see that as an actual report. But it is interesting that no movement has been made. And as a result of that, the Vikings have seen their market for Adrian Peterson diminish in a significant way. Now, it sounds like Dallas was in the running, but it sounds also like they never actually were really in the running, because it sounds like they were too concerned about the number of offensive dollars they were spending. And because of that, that's the reason they only offered DeMarco Murray $5 million when his market value was closer to $8 million. And so because of that, they probably weren't going to be in the market for Peterson, despite what everyone sort of thought about that. So Tampa Bay is said to be interested. There's one report from Tampa Bay's Scout.com affiliate, which is called Buck Splits, that says that Tampa Bay is putting together an aggressive plan to trade for Peterson. And then after that, the Buccaneers leaked to a reporter in some capacity that they only had moderate to low level interest. And then, Arizona was said to be interested and willing to offer a high pick. That's Charles Robinson from Yahoo Sports. And then Peter King actually reported that Arizona wasn't prepared to trade for Peterson. They were interested in him, but only in the event that he was cut and that they could renegotiate his salary, and they certainly wouldn't do it at that salary. Other teams that I think aren't being talked about, the San Diego Chargers, the San Francisco 49ers, who were not in that list of 5 teams, but could be people that they indicated that they were interested.
Oh, come on. No one of any interest is going to sign with the 49ers for the next 2 years, thanks to whatever Indian burial ground Levi Stadium was built on.
If San Francisco is stupid enough to give too many high picks, the Vikings aren't going to say no.
Of course that, but still, that's absurd. The 49ers are not getting any... I say that the 49ers aren't getting any breaks this offseason. Watch them win the Super Bowl this year. Watch it.
Yeah, I don't have words. Yeah.
So here's a random question. Why does the media seem to reach out to pro athletes' fathers? Like, we've mentioned the term blank player's father at least 4 times on the show already today. Why is that a thing now? The media just goes out to Adrian Peterson's father. Larry Fitzgerald's father is obviously in the media, but mentioning there was talk about a potential trade between Peterson and Fitzgerald. Like, people are going out to the athletes' fathers for information on these things. Why is that a thing?
I have no idea. It's because they're willing to talk, I guess.
Mike Wallace's father is going to talk about the potential trade, like between Mike Wallace's father or the running back, DeMarco Murray. DeMarco Murray's father is going to talk about the potential trade and the picks involved. Like, really?
Yeah, I don't know.
Why is that a thing?
Because they're willing to talk, and they're a source, and they presumably sort of know, what they presumably know what is happening in these athletes' lives, and so they seem like a source that knows what they're talking about, or at least has credibility to talk about the thing. and they're so willing to talk. So I guess that's why it's stupid, because they're not, necessarily.
But we only see this in pro football. Like, this isn't something that you see in pro basketball or baseball or something where, Albert Pujols' father knows about the teams that he said he's interested in. Like, nobody ends up interviewing the athlete's father for trade purposes for other sports. It's just football. And it seems like it's only like the last couple of years that this has actually become some place that the news is going to. So it's very strange. Moving on from Adrian Peterson, we can talk about our number of the week. And let's just stay with the San Francisco 49ers and go with the number 2.9 million.
Okay, so 49ers, 2.9 million. Is it the dead space they have from one of their stupid moves?
I wouldn't call it stupid, but it's another one of their retirements.
Oh, okay.
Chris Borland is walking away from that amount of money due to the fear of future concussions that he will experience. The news has made this into a very big story, and Pro Football, man, that was one hell of a meltdown that he had there when he was talking about Chris Borland. Deadspin covered some of it, and a friend of the show, the Falcoholic, had a nice post in there as well in the Deadspin article, as far as the meltdown that was had about Chris Borland. And it seems like the media is trying to turn this into more of a story than maybe it is. You have a player who led the 49ers in tackles, which is not that difficult to do considering the position. But had a pretty good year. Played something like 7-8 games this last year, and is walking away from the game due to fear of concussions. Now, he didn't have one this last year. He's a rookie. Did not have one last year. He's had 2 concussions in his life, much years ago, and is deciding now that he doesn't want to play in the NFL due to fear of concussions. Now, I think the question that's not being asked here is something along the lines of, is there something else we're missing? Because there's something happening here besides a fear of concussions. I have people trying to spin it as, oh, this is the future of the NFL. Players are going to play for a year or two and decide they've had too many concussions or something. But that's not what went on here. He didn't get a concussion last year. His bell didn't get rung in the middle of a game. He is walking away because of fear of future concussions. It just seems like something's off.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of things involved here. So I think that people who are talking about the death of the NFL, I think that you're right that they're sort of going a little bit too far here. I don't think it's likely at all. There's always going to be people who are willing to watch the game. There's always going to be people who are willing to play the game. And there are ways to reduce the risks that are associated with the problems that caused Chris Borland to retire. And he's not the only person to retire this young as a result of worries about concussions. I mean, people have already forgotten about Asher Allen, who retired at 24, I think, due to a fear of concussions. And, he wasn't very good, right, is the difference. And Chris Borland had this stellar year. Replacing Navarro Bowman, and because of that, it's bigger, I still don't think it's as big an issue as some people are saying, but I also don't think it's not a non-issue, because whether or not you have people who are willing to play the game, especially at those prices, doesn't mean you'll have a quality product on the field, right? Because the talent pool is enormous, but you can't just pick someone and have them play. I said I would compete with Chris Cook at cornerback in training camp. Obviously, I couldn't do that, right? for 800 reasons, right?
It's okay to just admit skinny knees and your pro day wasn't all that impressive. It's okay.
Yeah, I mean, my pro day was subpar, but I wasn't wearing gloves, so who knows.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you have to worry about a diminishing talent pool at one end of the bell curve that represents 0.001% of a relevant population. And so if they start dropping off, then you have a reduction of talent in the NFL, and that's not fun to watch. I mean, we do watch the NCAA, and it's fine because they have a significant reduction in talent compared to the NFL. They still produce a fun product, but a lot of the reason NCAA football is great is not necessarily the product on the field, but also sort of all of the things that are wrapped up in it. The pageantry is a word that they use a lot. It's fairly obnoxious but useful here that you don't actually even have in the NFL. You just don't have the kind of attachments that you have in college football that you do in the NFL, and so you have some problems there. The CFL is very difficult to watch. I've tried many times. And so, yeah. So it's not like the NFL would die, but it would be really annoying to have to. And if you watch Thursday night football, but all the time, would that not diminish the product?
I don't think I would be a fan if we had Thursday night football type games every game. Like that would be a bit much.
Right. And so that's an issue. And so if you can reduce the potential talent pool in that way, I think then there are issues that people are dismissing just because of the number of people who would be willing to play in the NFL. They're not willing to play at an NFL level because they can't play at an NFL level. But there are other things that interact with this. I think that it's not as settled in terms of the science, the relationship between concussions and the buildup of tau in the brain and later neurodegenerative diseases, especially because a lot of the things that are happening to NFL players, issues involving depression and suicide attempts and anxiety, those were not typically associated with tau buildup in the brain. Tau buildup was generally associated with Alzheimer's and these other diseases. And, I'm not a doctor and I haven't done an exhaustive review of literature, so I could be misspeaking. I don't think I am. But the point is the science is not particularly settled. And in fact, there's like a Zurich conference on concussions every year. And they are actually pretty upset with what's, I think it's called just the Boston Consensus in terms of concussions. They're upset with how certain it's being presented. And the reason that's an issue is not because I don't think there's a problem with the way the NFL treats former players or the likelihood of players having mental issues later in life, because it seems pretty clear, even with just anecdotal evidence, but also it seems like sort of a larger body of data, that there are issues if you play in the NFL or if you play enough football to have played in the NFL, and that there's a higher likelihood of incidences or problems later in life. But the issue is in how to solve the problem, because if the problem isn't macro level concussions, then changing the rules about tackling don't help. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that would at least imply or suggest that it isn't macro level concussions at all. And in fact, talking about macro level concussions obfuscates the issue. The issue is micro concussions, and that's why offensive linemen or defensive linemen or linebackers. In fact, the people you hear most about are linebackers and defensive linemen suffer from this issue. Like Dave Dorson and Chris Borland is worried about this, and Junior Seau and Richard Dent. These are people who don't suffer as many macro concussions, the kinds that Chris Borland talked about, the kind that media talks about, but suffer from tons of micro concussions. And the relationship between them and tau buildup is not established, right? The relationship between any number of these things is not established. But if it's a different issue, if the issue is not big hits, which the NFL is trying to legislate away, but the issue is in fact a bunch of tiny hits, then the solution is different. And so the NFL needs to get a handle on that. And once they get a handle on what the issue or what the problem is, they may be able to craft solutions. The NFL is already scared to craft solutions. And evidently, according to some safety experts, because of bad legal advice. Because the NFL doesn't want to mandate that you wear these kinds of helmets, because if these kinds of helmets barely or don't even at all reduce the likelihood of incidences of microconcussions, they think they can expose themselves to further liability because they'll be seen as having guaranteed against the likelihood of that in the future, which is not what happens when you mandate safer gear. But for some reason, this is like a problem that they think they have. But if you can produce better helmets, then you can create an NFL that has the exact same rules that significantly reduces the likelihood of microconcussions on these plays. And if you can do that, you may be able to resolve most of the concerns. So it is a problem, but it's a problem that could potentially have a solution in the future. But if it has a solution in the future, it needs to be talked about, I think, with a bit more scientific rigor. One thing that Chris Borland talked about, though, is he only had 2 diagnosed concussions. He did mention in training camp that he did get a concussion, and he just played through it because he didn't want to report it because he didn't want to lose his spot, which I don't know if that's a solvable problem.
It seems like that ends up being a personal thing that surprise Roger Goodell cannot actually find a way to enforce.
Right.
So that was our number of the week. And before we get on to our new wildly inaccurate prognostications, we do have a special report that Arif was correct. Arif's one last week was Vikings will make a splash with a free agent signing of $7.5 million a year or more. I think we did the math on our new wide receiver. That's a hell of an amount of money for him.
Yeah, I think I technically was wrong, but I think I was correct in the spirit of the prognostication. So it wasn't a signing; correct. It was a trade. But I think I fulfilled the spirit of the mandate. So that's nice because I'm very
technically correct. The best kind of correct.
I very rarely get to be right on these, so I'm glad I got
I will take it. So, I was thinking about my wildly inaccurate prognostication, and I had a good one. I was going to say that Trent Richardson was going to get picked up by the Raiders and start a game this year. And then most of that happened. I was really upset at the Raiders for signing him now as opposed to, while we're recording, so I can say, that happened. No. Screw you, Raiders. So, instead, I'm going to change it up a little bit and go with the hard-hitting Ray Rice. I say Ray Rice is going to start a game this year.
The hard-hitting Ray, you're awful. Ray Rice is going to start a game this year? Ray Rice, very improbable.
Ray Rice starts a game this year.
Okay.
I'm not saying by whom, for whom, because that
would reduce it to like a vanishingly small probability. Fair enough.
I'm not going to say that he returns to Baltimore or anything, but no. Ray Rice starts a game this year.
Well, think about the 3 teams that are in contention for Greg Hardy, who appealed his conviction for domestic assault and then was able to settle it out of court. Well, it's not called settling out of court when you pay a witness in a criminal case to not show up, but that's what happened. Anyway, he is no longer
ignoring that aspect.
There are teams that are in contention for someone who has the committed domestic violence stigma attached to him. The Cowboys, the Raiders, and the Buccaneers, which are 3 groups of people who, the mascots notoriously not friendly to women, so maybe it fits.
That's where we're gonna get our cue. That's gonna be the secret to unlocking who gets the Ray Rice's gold.
All 3 of those teams do need a running back. That's all I'm saying.
The Bengals have a history of taking on players that from the land, the time is forgot. Players with big. with players with personnel issues and bad histories of things, it's entirely possible that he could stay in the AFC and end up getting picked up by like the Bengals. Because who's the Bengals? The running back for the Bengals for their backup.
Now they're pretty happy. It's Gio Bernard and Jeremy Hill.
Oh, that's right, Jeremy Hill.
Yeah, pretty.
Still, he wouldn't be bad as just a body on that staff.
Oh, sure, he wouldn't be bad. That's for sure. Well, assuming that he doesn't play like he did in his final year in the NFL, which was abysmal.
He just fell forward.
Yeah. But yeah.
Which I imagine we'll be talking about a little bit later as well. But what is your wildly inaccurate prognostication?
That the Vikings will, at the conclusion of training camp, have on their roster of 53 7 receivers.
Going with 7 receivers on the 53-man roster.
Yep, 7.
Interesting.
Very few teams do this. Norv Turner did this once, in like 2011, but it's very, very difficult to find a team that carries 7 wide receivers. It's usually 4 to 6, if 6.
So you would be looking at our new guy. You'd be looking at Jarius Wright. You would be looking at Adam Thielen. Who else would you end up looking at as far as like the 7th? And obviously people we're not that are not on the team yet, but
yeah, well, yeah. So you'd have Wallace, Wright, Patterson, Johnson, Thielen. That's 5. Then Kane Coulter. That's 6. And then a drafted receiver, hopefully a possession type. That's 7.
Maybe we can just sign T-Jack and throw him out there too. He's got Super Bowl experience.
Yeah, and he can win you some coin flips.
that is what he does. Let's move on to our mailbag, and we've got a couple of really good questions. And let's just break into the Wallace stuff first. First question is from Justin Pullman, who asks, "What does the Wallace trade tell us about Mike Zimmer and the front office's mentality going into this and the next few years?"
I mean, that's a really broad question that I can't answer in sort of like a quick hit, and I'd have to think about it. I'd have to think it through. But I would say, I mean, the team is continuing to invest in upside, which is a little unusual given that Wallace is not necessarily young. But yeah, I think I think that they continuously invest in upside. I think that they take small chances on personalities in terms of their investments, but not large ones. I think that they care more about players who fit particular skill sets than they do complete players or finding players or fitting players into the system. I think that they'd rather find particular skill sets. And that's the whole point of Mike Wallace. That's the reason they get rid of Greg Jennings. And so I think that, which is actually a very Belichick thing to do. People always talk about how Belichick fits his systems to his players. Not really true. And I've mentioned this on the podcast at least 2 or 3 times, and it might even be annoying now. But Belichick only scouts for particular traits. So players that are severely deficient in a trait that would make them bad at the position that they're playing can be good in particular situations or systems. And that's and if they happen to have those specific set of traits that Belichick admires or wants in that system, that's what he does. And I think that the Vikings are doing something very similar. Because Mike Wallace, one-note receiver. And I don't know if you can find necessarily a more one-dimensional receiver in the NFL. So if you can incorporate that dimension relatively well, then he can fit your system. So I think that's kind of what the Vikings are doing. They invest in upside. They are willing to expose themselves to limited, character risk on their investments, and they really want to stay young, even though Mike Wallace isn't necessarily young.
Yeah, the other mention from Pullman was that it feels like the team is gearing up for an opening for a Super Bowl window. Do you think that ends up happening in the next couple of years?
No, Not next year, but soonish.
With the young amount of players that we have and getting better and better, obviously it's possible. It's sort of like a Blaine Gabbert Pro Bowl clause. It may happen. It's good to write down.
Might as well get credit for it if it happens.
Logan Mironov Chin says, let's say AP's gone. Over under on the percentage of Vikings drives that start with a 1 yard Asiata run. Or what is ostensibly the Ray Rice fall forward.
So you have to. So the over under is informed by whether or not Adrian Peterson is going to be on the roster, right? And whether or not Asiata starts, right? Because it's drives started by, right? I think that you get about 12 drives a game. You get about 16 games. I think that if we assume let's say it's 50-50, right? That Peterson, is on the roster. I think that in the case where Peterson is on the roster, you have very few drives, right? You have 1 to 5 drives. Peterson's not on the roster. I think that chance increases substantially, and I think that Asiata can become part of a running back by committee, depending on whether or not they draft a running back or whatever. If they do draft a running back, that doesn't help. But I think that we'll probably get 2 to 3 drives a game that start with an Asiata run. About half of those will probably get, the 1 yard, right? So if you do that, then the math works out 10 as the over-under. 10 drives.
That's a mighty specific number. All right. Next question for you is from Agromagnet, who says, how is Wallace with contested passes?
Better than Johnson and Patterson. Better than advertised. That doesn't mean he's great. I don't think he's great at them, but he's definitely better than who they have on the roster.
Brian Heitz asks, if Bostic scores a touchdown at Lambeau this next year, will he attempt a Lambeau leap?
God, that would be hilarious. I hope so. Yes. Let's just say yes.
Brian Orcutt asks, what is the plan at left guard?
Who knows, Brian?
That nervous laugh is all of us right there.
Yeah, so I will say this. I think that the fact that they were low-balling Clint Bowling, that they weren't in on Mike Upati or Orlando Franklin, and haven't contacted players like Mike Polak, I think it tells you that while they would have liked to have a player like Clint Bowling on the roster, they basically I wouldn't say gambled. They did a risk assessment, which was we are reasonably sure that Bowling is somewhat better than the players we currently have on our roster to compete for the left guard position, but we're not $5 million a year short, even if we think that Bowling is worth in the abstract $5 million a year, because we have these other 3 players that are under contract with us. So I think the reason they didn't get Bowling and the reason that they didn't pay a lot of money to get Bowling is because they made a risk assessment choice based on the people in the reasonable confidence, not a ton of confidence, not a low amount of confidence, but a reasonable-ish amount of confidence in the players that they have on the roster to play left guard. And there's probably going to be an open competition between Michael Harris, who just signed his restricted free agent tender, David Yankee, who's still on the depth chart at left guard, and Joe Berger, who wanted starting money and got not that, but a pretty good amount of money. So that's the plan.
That's a very sad kind of series of plans there. Nothing really good happening at left guard right now.
Yankee could break out. Who knows, man?
Yeah, it's certainly possible. I mean, it's not quite as bad as the Pro Bowl contract thing, but yeah, still. Next question comes from Nordic Fan Focus, who asks, what is the plan to stabilize a wide receiver core lacking solid ground? Jennings' absence is the absence of reliability and a true slot wide receiver.
Yeah, I agree with you, Nordic Fan Focus, and I think that Jarius Wright is a different kind of slot receiver, so you can't really say that he replaces Jennings. And I was talking about this earlier in the podcast, assuming you were listening to that portion too. I'm not so sure what the plan is to add reliability, especially on third downs, or like an outlet option. I don't know. I guess draft a sure-handed receiver would be my guess. And it doesn't have to be in the first round.
It doesn't have to be first round. That's certainly have a number of picks, and Rick Spielman doesn't seem like the type that just likes to go into the draft with the picks he has. Seems to want everybody else's.
Yeah.
Speaking of Spielman, Jake Anderson at NFL Draft Talker, who's a fantastic follow, says, now that Spielman has found a QB, where would you rank him among the league's best general managers? I would say in the top 10, says Jake Anderson.
Yeah, I think in the top 10. I think that makes sense. A lot of people will say, well, let me look at how many playoff wins he has, which is, not many outside of the Brett Favre era, and that wasn't even as a GM. But I think that that's not really a reasonable way to look at what a general manager does, because their job is to accumulate and keep talent, and a coach's job is to turn that talent into wins. And I think we can pretty fairly say that the previous coaching staffs are not very good. I would say that Spielman is a very good general manager. I would say top 10. Obviously, he hasn't had enough drafts with him in charge of the drafts to say that we have a reasonable understanding of how good he is. But most general managers who are fired never get that chance, so who knows?
Yeah. Here is the best question of the day. It comes from Ian Pauley, who asks, which do you prefer, waffles or pancakes, and why is it waffles?
Man, this waffles pancakes thing on Twitter is so annoying. My breakfast starches are conditional. Sometimes I prefer waffles, sometimes I prefer pancakes, and that doesn't make me a monster.
You hear that? He's not a monster. He's a human being. I don't get an opportunity to have waffles that often.
Get a waffle maker.
Well, thank you. I'll just go get married and someone will buy that for me then. No, it's...
Didn't that happen?
I am not married, but I am with a woman who is half Canadian, and as a result, all of her family sends us maple syrup for Christmas, and I'm not making that up. We have a fine array of maple syrups, which you can go in depth on the whole maple syrup thing and find there's different qualities in them. Different numbers are associated with darkness. I forget my favorite darkness of for type, but there is a thing. It is actually a thing, and I have pancakes far more than I have waffles. And if I have to decide, I mean, waffle feels a bit more like a treat, but I think I'm a pancake person, which I'm imagining is going to make Kyle Segal just think I'm the Antichrist.
Oh, is he Team Waffle?
I just assume that he's everything that I'm not, as far as food.
Oh, that's true, because I guess you put ketchup on hot dogs like a normal.
I've put ketchup on a hot dog. I don't have milk with my cereal, which apparently makes me a serial killer. I'm taking that joke out. That's not actually what I meant to say there. Sorry.
Wait, did you literally not mean to do that?
I literally did not mean to do that.
That's such bullshit. Also, that does make you an awful person. Both the pun and the fact that you don't have milk with cereal. That is the worst. That is that is distinct from your hot dog preference, which evidently is regional, and your pancake waffle preference, which who gives a shit. Your preference for having cereal without milk is just it's grounds for damnation, I think.
Grounds for damnation. And Kyle will say that I'm in league with the devil for this, but I have no. I'm just not a milk with cereal guy. I was always a grab a handful and run and eat on the run. I was never sit down and have the cereal with milk. It just never happened when I was a kid. So, but that's beside the point. I'm a pancake person. That's just what I am. But this leads us to our problem. We need a new slogan. Christian Ponder is no longer on the team, and we are definitely in need of new slogans. Now, one thing we could do is try out a new slogan every week and just see if something works. If you have suggestions, please send it to the Norse Code DN Twitter account. We will be happy to look at them. Kyle, and we will take a look and see if there's something that we can have for the end of our show. But this is different. We haven't done a show without Christian Ponder on the team before. We're heading into the rare air here.
Yeah, it's a new era for Norse Code podcasting.
Yes, that's it. It's not a new era for the Vikings. No, only focused on us.
That would indicate that for the Vikings, the Christian Ponder era was an era and not a blip. For the podcast that has only existed during the Christian Ponder era, it is in fact an era because we have a much smaller time frame to work off of.
Very true. Very true. Do you have anything to plug before we take off?
Nope. I am publishing nearly every day at Bleacher Report, so be sure to check me out there. I've got a writer page if you want to take a look at that. Otherwise, just head over to the Minnesota Vikings section of Bleacher Report, and to the right, you'll see my most recent piece. So I am publishing a little bit more often than I used to, and hopefully I haven't taken a hit in quality as a result.
You can always check him out also at Vikings Territory. You can follow him at Twitter at ArifHassanDN. You can follow myself at Big Mono, or I also manage the Norse Code Twitter account at Norse Code DN. Dusty, who's on assignment this week, should be back. He can be found at Norse Code Dusty. If you would like to participate and become a producer, executive producer of the show, if you'd like to donate to the show, you can go to NorseCodePodcast.com. At the very bottom of the page, we have our support Norse Code area. But for Arif, for Dusty, for myself, we'd like to thank you for listening to this week's episode, and we would like to remind you of one very simple thing. Arif Hassan still has the same amount of interceptions as Chris Cook. See you next week.
Norse Code is the official podcast of the Daily Norseman SB Nation blog and is produced with cooperation from Pompous Jerk Productions. Pompous Jerk Productions. Attitude with attitude. The opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of their contributors and do not reflect official positions of the Minnesota Vikings, SB Nation, the Daily Norseman staff, or PJP. No information in this podcast should be construed as gambling advice. Please obey all local gaming laws.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.